Okay, everyone, thanks for joining us. Welcome to Encore Learning Presents. My name is David Tate, and I'm a member of the Encore Learning Special Events Committee. We work hard to bring you these presentations as well as organize tours. These presentations are public. The tours are member-only events. So if you're not already a member, you're watching this, member of Encore Learning, and you're watching this, and you're of a certain age, please consider joining Encore Learning. There are lots of benefits. We have virtual classes as well as in-person classes, spring and fall semesters. So you can certainly go to encorelearning.net and learn all about us. Now, earlier this year, we had a speaker that was predicting the next presidential race. He hasn't actually come out with his prediction yet. We'll keep you posted if he does or when he does. But today we have a speaker that is going to tell us how we got to the place we are in today, at least with one political party. But before we get into introductions and the presentations, I do need to do just a quick tech talk. So this is just so that people know how to do the controls. So the first thing to know is that if you want to ask questions, use the Q&A function, not the chat function. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but you can put your questions in to the chat at any time, and we'll hold them until the end of the session and let the speaker answer them. The other thing is that we do have live transcript or closed caption options here. So you can either have it on or off. That's under your control. So you just find the icon relating to that and click on it if you want to turn it on or if you want to turn it off. And also, when you leave this webinar, you'll see a survey request. It's brief. We certainly do appreciate if you would take that. And if you have any problems with Zoom, you can send an email to info@encorelearning.net. And one of the things I'll just mention is that, so there are extensive slides here, and sometimes I know that, well, most of the time the slides will appear more or less full screen for people, but if it doesn't, that's under your control. You just have to click and find the controls to adjust that. Just try whatever you can. You can't break Zoom, I guarantee you. If you get kicked off, just sign on again. So that's under your control. Okay, and just one more thing before I pass it on to introductions, and I want to let people know about upcoming events. July 10th, we have a session talking about pickleball, which is growing all the time. We have two local experts to tell you all about pickleball, give you the history of it, how to play it. So if you're not already playing, it can give you the confidence to go out and play. And there's lots of opportunities in Arlington to play pickleball. And then on July 24th, we have a novelist, Ann Beltran, who will be talking about her latest novel, Faith on the Mall, which is a historical novel that centers around the National Mall around the Civil War time. So she's done impeccable research, and I certainly learned a lot of history reading it, but it's also much more than history. The characters are fantastic, and you see history unfold through the eyes of the characters. So that's something you want to put on your calendar as well. So finally, that's the end of the tech talk. I'm going to pass it on to Chris McLaughlin, who is the chair of the Encore Learning Special Events Committee, and she will introduce our very special speaker today. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. As David mentioned, I'm Chris McLaughlin, and I am chair of the Special Events Committee. And I'm showing this slide because our speaker today has given a lot of his time and talent to Encore Learning in teaching full courses. Today is a special event, which is a one and done. But I took his most recent course in the spring and learned more about the 20s and 30s in America than I ever hoped to learn. So I'm a big fan of our speaker, and he has done a lot of work putting together today's presentation. So David, if you want to take this down so that the other David can put his slides up, then we're good to transition.
Yep.
Let's see. I'm not seeing my slides up.
I think it looked like it was coming up and then it didn't. So give it another try.
Okay.
Maybe
Okay.
it just takes a little while, maybe. Okay, there it is.
Yeah.
I think we're good to go.
Looks great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, many thanks to David and Chris and Laura for helping me put this together. I'm really looking forward to making this presentation. The very good pre-talk publicity that Chris put out gives you a feel from what I'm going to be covering. But the basic subject of the talk will be the transition from the cheerful and optimistic conservatism of the Reagan administration to the bitter and hostile conservatism of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. Let's make America great again. The conversion to MAGA began in the 1990s after Reagan left office and we won the Cold War, ending a lot of the rationale for his type of conservatism. During the 1990s, the three individuals we're going to focus on, Pat Buchanan, Rush Limbaugh, and Newt Gingrich, developed a new approach to conservatism, which they then called paleoconservatism, but which has come to be called MAGA. Now, after the 1990s, these ideas didn't instantly take over the Republican Party. In the early 2000s, the party was preoccupied with the war in Iraq, and they turned to more moderate leaders such as Bush, McCain, and Romney. But in 2016, Paleo and MAGA did take control. I should caveat at the outset, I'm not going to cover very extensively what happened between 2000 and 2016, why the new ideas of these three individuals, why it took them 16 years to take control of the Republican Party. I'm just going to focus on the ideas themselves, and how they came to take over the party is still somewhat controversial and still somewhat in play. We're going to start with an overview, and then we'll be going into much more detail on these points. What are the differences between Reagan's conservatism and the paleoconservatism or MAGA? Well, for Reagan's conservative, the main emphasis was on winning the Cold War. And this theme and rationale disappeared when the Cold War was over, and the MAGA conservatives, paleoconservatives, shifted to an emphasis on the grievances of white males who did not attend college. And in this course, we'll be exploring how that agenda differs from an agenda which is mainly designed to defeat communism. Both types of conservatism support greater economic freedom, less government regulations, lower taxes, less of a safety net. But to Reagan, it's much more important. To Reagan, it's the center of what he wants American society to be. And he strongly believed that economic freedoms, freedom from regulation, promoted political freedoms. And that if we practiced economic freedoms, we would become a model for the world, overtaking the Soviet model. One area in which there were major differences between Reagan conservatism and paleoconservatism were on immigration and free trade. Reagan, as we'll see, was a big supporter of immigration. He thought it made us a much better society. He was a supporter of free trade. The paleo and MAGA conservatives oppose immigration, and they generally oppose free trade. They want protectionism and America first. Similarly, in international involvement, Reagan conservatism emphasized a worldwide military and security involvement to fight the communists. paleo-MAGA conservatives have retreated to Republican isolationism of the 1930s. They only want U.S. intervention when it's going to promote our financial interests or their immediate military threats. Both Reagan conservatism and MAGA conservatism support the culture war agenda of the religious right and moral majority. Some of the issues are abortion. Feminism was a big issue in the Reagan days, gay rights, and place of religion in public life, particularly religion in the schools. Both sides, both types of conservatism adopted kind of a racist approach against African Americans, but it wasn't really done by direct attacks on African Americans. It was done by code words or what has come to be called dog whistles, which would convince those who were not in favor of Black rights that Reagan and the MAGA conservatives were on their side without them ever having to say they were on their side on a lot of issues. There's a major difference in tone between Reagan's conservatism and the paleo-MAGA conservatism. Reagan had a tone of civility. He was optimistic about America. He was willing to engage in bipartisanship. Paleo and MAGA emphasized by a lack of civility, by pessimism about the current state of America, by emphasizing polarization rather than bipartisanship. There's a very good summary of the transition from Reagan conservatism to paleo-MAGA conservatism, written by Kim Phillips Fine in the Atlantic. And quote Ms. Fine, "Not all that long ago, the GOP was the party of big business, free markets, traditional family values, and anti-communism. Now it has become the party of election denial and the wall. Trump and the Republican Party are dominated by gloomy, bitter conservatism, its rhetoric tinged with loss and preoccupied with themes of masculinity, race, and immigration. A far cry from Reagan's upbeat invocation of freedom and morning in America. It's hard to imagine Reagan leading cheers of lock her up or inventing Trump-style nicknames for his enemies." Now let's look at the three individuals we're going to be considering who are in the forefront of developing paleo-conservatism, which has ultimately led to MAGA. First, Pat Buchanan. He was a conservative media star. He was active as an advisor to the Reagan and Nixon administrations, and he ran for the presidency 3 times during the 1990s and did quite respectably. Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House in the early to mid-1990s, developed an approach of extreme partisanship and demonization of the Democrats. Rush Limbaugh was the pioneer of conservative talk radio, consisting and biased radio and TV generally. Limbaugh was the first to have a talk show of several hours dealing with political issues on a biased basis, and so his fans could just listen to him for hours on end and get all their information and views from him. This is the forerunner of the biased cable and internet news which we've had today. So considering these in order, Pat Buchanan is noteworthy for his policies and his style of campaigning, which, as you'll see, bear great similarities, almost eerie similarities in some cases, to the policies and the catchphrases of Trump. He was born in Washington, D.C. in 1938. He had a great-grandfather who fought for the Confederacy, and Pat was a proud member of the Sons of the Confederacy. He graduated from Georgetown in '61, He got a master's in journalism from Columbia. His master's thesis was on criticizing Canada for trading with communist Cuba while we were boycotting them. And it was, I haven't read his thesis, but apparently it was quite convincing. And he got hired as an editorial writer for the St. Louis Globe Democrat when he was 23 years old. In the early 1960s, he met and developed a relationship with Richard Nixon. He was the first person Nixon hired for his campaign and presidency in '68. And during his presidency, he was, as you'll see, he's very articulate and able to create memorable phrases. He's the one who developed the term the silent majority, which was the theme of Nixon's campaign. He also wrote some speeches for Spiro Agnew, and one of his famous lines, which he gave Agnew to criticize his opponents, was that they were the nattering nabobs of negativity. After the Nixon administration, he became a media star. In those days, you didn't have generally TV shows which took one point of view. You had TV shows which were debates between liberals and conservatives, such as Crossfire, the McLaughlin Group, and the Capital Gang. Pat was frequently on those shows. During the Reagan administration, he served as advisor to Reagan. After the Reagan administration, he is quoted as having said that Pat Buchanan, the greatest vacuum in American politics is to the right of Ronald Reagan. And true to his belief, during the 1990s, he ran for the presidency 3 times on an agenda which was to the right of Reagan on such issues as immigration, free trade, global involvement, culture wars, and racism. He did, as you can see from this chart, he did quite respectably in those, in his primaries, where in the 1990s, 92, he runs against the incumbent George H.W. Bush, and he began with a very strong showing in New Hampshire, 38% of the vote. And then overall, in all primaries, he got 22%. In 1996, he ran in primaries against Bob Dole. He won New Hampshire, and Pat Buchanan did, and he received 22% in all primaries. In 2000, he ran as a third party, the Reform Party, and this was much less successful. He received less than 1% of the vote in the general election. Now let's go point by point on some of the differences between Reagan and Buchanan. What ways is Buchanan to the right of Reagan? Reagan was a big fan of immigration. Buchanan was a big opponent of immigration, blaming immigrants for crime, drugs, and urban violence. Reagan was very eloquent in his support of immigration. First, he believed that immigrants could make a major contribution to our economy. To quote Reagan, "It makes one wonder about the illegal alien fuss. Are great numbers of our unemployed really victims of the illegal and alien invasion, or are those illegal tourists actually doing work which our people won't do?" He specifically mentioned that there were couples were riding on trees in New England because there weren't enough people to pick them. And he said, as long as this was the case, why shouldn't we be bringing in immigrants to pick them? His view of immigration was that the diversity it created was a great tribute to America. In his farewell address, he spoke of America as a shining city. In my mind, it was a tall, proud city, built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with a willing heart to get here. and specifically on the issue of border walls, which became a staple of Buchanan and then Donald Trump. Reagan said, "You don't build a 9-foot fence along the border between two friendly nations." He thought that immigrants and their different cultures made a great contribution to America. He said, "I think it's really closer to the truth to say that America has assimilated as much as our immigrants have. It's made for a delightful diversity, and it's made us a stronger and more vital nation." In great contrast, Buchanan saw illegal immigration as a major problem. In 1992, he went to the Mexican border, and in his address there, he said, "I am calling attention to a national disgrace, the failure of the national government of the United States to protect the borders of the United States from an illegal invasion that involves at least 1 million aliens a year. As a consequence of that, we have social problems and economic problems and drug problems." He specifically commented on riots that took place after the Rodney King trial. You remember Rodney King was badly beaten by police officers, and the beating was captured on video. And the first jury considering the case let the police officers off, and this led to major riots and protests for the verdict of not guilty. And Buchanan's take on it was that, and what was going on in Los Angeles, foreigners are coming into this country illegally and helping to burn down one of the greatest cities in America. And as an obvious predecessor to Donald Trump, Buchanan proposed building a 2-mile wall along the Mexican border, which he called the Buchanan fence. On free trade, there were also major differences. Reagan generally was a supporter of free trade. To quote him, "I recognize the inescapable conclusion that all of history has taught. The freer the flow of world trade, the stronger the tides of human progress and peace among nations." And in carrying this out, he entered into the agreement establishing the World Trade Organization designed to reduce and eliminate tariffs. And he signed the predecessor of the NAFTA agreement, a free trade agreement with Canada. Buchanan took a very negative view of free trade. He said that free trade is turning America into two nations, an elite of professionals prospering beyond their dreams, and a mass of workers suffering middle-class anxiety, downsized hopes, and vanished dreams. There were major differences on, let me just, I'm going to keep going. I had a good quote I missed, but I don't want to backtrack. There were major differences between the two of them on the extent to which we should be involved internationally. Reagan favored our worldwide involvement. The Soviet communists were operating on a worldwide basis, and we had to operate on a worldwide basis to oppose them. With the Cold War over, Buchanan supported isolationism. He believed that we should only get involved when there is a direct threat to the United States or when it would benefit America's financial agreement. And then reminiscent of a predecessor of Donald Trump's attitude towards some of our major alliances, Buchanan questioned why we should be paying so much to defend other countries. Buchanan said, "Bush's New World Order is beginning to sound like old world freeloading. Uncle Sam does the fighting and Uncle Sam pays the bill. It is time for a new foreign policy that looks out for America first, and not only America first, but America second and third. If Germany and Japan are big enough and tough enough to carry American markets, they are big enough and tough enough to carry their own load in their defense." On culture war issues. Reagan was a supporter of the religious right on culture wars on such issues as abortion, prayer in the schools, and gay rights. One of his early statements on this was a famous statement he made to a meeting of evangelical leaders, where he said, "I know you can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you." In practice, culture war issues such as abortion, prayer in the schools, and gay rights were not his highest priority. He would not exert all his political capital on them. He appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court because he wanted to get a woman appointed to the court, even though religious right objected that she might be a little squishy on abortion, which from their viewpoint, she turned out to be. He gave some support to Congress to pass amendments on banning abortion and allowing school prayer. But when these stalled in the Congress, he didn't make any great efforts to get them underway. His general approach seems to be that the religious right was a group to be accommodated among many other groups, and that they had no choice but to vote for him because the Democrats would be so much more hostile on their issues. So he didn't have to give in to their every demand. He gave them a certain number of symbolic recognition. He named C. Everett Koop to be Surgeon General. Koop was a pediatric surgeon and a very strong and famous opponent of abortion. He invited religious leaders to the White House from time to time. He had Jerry Falwell make the final benediction at the GOP nominating convention. But when it came down to it, he was not necessarily an all-out supporter of culture war issues at the expense of others. AIDS presented a particular challenge to Reagan. He had splits in his constituency. Some of the religious right believed that AIDS was a divine punishment for the sins of gay people. Others were sympathetic to the young gay men who were dying from AIDS at a fast rate. Reagan tried to stay in the middle on this issue. He never mentioned AIDS publicly until Rock Hudson made a career as a very glamorous leading man, but turned out to be gay. And, Rock died of AIDS. And after that, Reagan started recognizing it as a major problem. But he never went so far as to support his Surgeon General, C. Everett Koop, who on the issue of gays, the Surgeon General was on a big campaign to get gays to use condoms, which this was before medications were available, and that was the only way for them to protect themselves. Pat Buchanan never had to deal with governing, but he was very militant on culture war issues. He had no doubts about which side he was on AIDS. He's quoted as saying, "The poor homosexual, they declared war on nature, and now nature is exacting an awful retribution." On culture war issues of feminism and abortion, he came out very strongly for the religious right position. This was in the context of attacking Bill and Hillary Clinton for their supposed liberal attitudes, radical attitudes on these issues. Buchanan gave a very strong speech at the 1992 Republican convention on culture war issues, and some believe that this is what may have ended up costing George H.W. Bush his re-election. Some of the quotes from that speech about Hillary Clinton and anti-feminism. Hillary believes that 12-year-olds should have the right to sue their parents. And Hillary has compared marriage and the family as institutions to slavery and life on an Indian reservations. This, my friends, is radical feminism. The agenda that Clinton would impose on America: abortion on demand, a litmus test for the Supreme Court, homosexual rights, discrimination against religious schools, women in combat units. That's change, all right, but it's not the kind of change America needs. It's not the kind of change America wants. And it's not the kind of change we can abide in a nation that we still call God's country. And in his famous closing remarks, he made it clear that he thought culture war issues were more important than economic issues. My friend, this election is about more than who gets what. It's about who we are. It's about what we believe and what we stand for as Americans. There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a culture war, as critical as to the kind of nation we shall be, as was the Cold War itself. For this war is for the soul of America. There are also major differences between Reagan and Buchanan on support for authoritarian, anti-democratic governments. Reagan did sometimes support authoritarian governments, but it's not because he preferred authoritarianism, but because he saw them as needed allies in the Cold War. Buchanan much more believed in authoritarianism as a principle. He believed that authoritarians could be more efficient than democratic institutions. In one column, he cited IBM and the Marine Corps as anti-democratic or non-democratic institutions, and he claimed they were much more efficient than our democratic government was. He also supported authoritarian governments that would promote the positions he favored in the culture wars. Later on in late or the 20-teens, he became a strong supporter of Putin because of Putin's willingness to get rid of, proceed vigorously against gay people. On racial issues, I'd say both Reagan and Buchanan tended to issue anti-Black dog whistles. This was a follow-up on a strategy first used by Richard Nixon, where you want to get the votes of Southern and others who are racist, but you don't want to say directly that you're a racist and support everything they want. So you do this by dog whistles or little symbolic gestures or remarks that show you're really on their side. Nixon started this by appealing to law and order and the war on drugs, which were signal that he was anti-Black. Reagan followed up. He began his presidential campaign in 1980 in Neshoba County, Mississippi. This is where the 3 civil rights workers were murdered in 1964. But in his speech there, he didn't talk about the civil rights workers. He talked about states' rights. He would also use various phrases, obviously referring to Blacks, talking about welfare queens, young bucks who bought steaks with food stamps. He claimed that city streets and the big cities were dangerous, and he referred to them as jungle paths. Buchanan came on even stronger. He gave some support to David Duke in the 1990s. Duke had been the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, and he left that post, not because he had any great revelations about racial issues, but to enter into a political career. And he did actually get elected to the Louisiana legislature. And then he ran campaigns for, first for the US Senate from Louisiana and for governor of Louisiana, both of which he lost. But Buchanan urged his fellow Republicans not to be too negative about David Duke and to not necessarily adopt all his racist views, but to adopt his general views, which were in line with Republican views of being against crime, being against affirmative action. Buchanan gave a comparable to Reagan's Neshoba County speech. Buchanan held a campaign event at Stone Mountain, Georgia. This is where the Ku Klux Klan was reformed in the 19-teens. And there's a monument there, Stone Mountain, which has been called the Confederate Mount Rushmore. And there are statues there of, or carvings there of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson. Buchanan spoke very favorably of them, and also the Georgia's governor, Eugene Talmadge, who was a notable racist and segregationist. Nicole Hemmer, in writing about Buchanan and comparing Buchanan and Reagan on racial issues, said that Reagan's dog whistle had been replaced with Buchanan's bullhorn. There was also a great difference in style of the Buchanan campaign with Reagan's campaign. Buchanan's campaigns were reminiscent of what the Trump campaigns would become. Buchanan would give a series of attack lines on all the enemies and get the audience all stirred up and whooping and yelling and applauding at those attack lines. And he also prided himself on being as outrageous as possible. Now let's turn to our second major figure, that's Newt Gingrich. He was a member of the House of Representatives from 1978 to 1999. And in the early 1990s, he became a leader of the Republican Party in the House, first serving as minority whip. That was the second highest position in the Republican leadership at the time. And then Speaker of the House, 95 through 99. He did have conservative political views, but what he's most noteworthy for is destroying the atmosphere of bipartisanship and general limits on harsh rhetoric, which characterized the House. And he sort of has permanently seemingly converted the House into a very partisan, harshly critical place. And this is under Trump, this is spread to the country at large. The polarization which Gingrich created in the House has spread to the country at large. Reagan was supported a certain degree of bipartisanship. He and Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, developed a friendship, and but they were able to work together on some issues. They would frequently get together on an informal basis and sharing drinks and Irish jokes. When Reagan was shot, O'Neill was one of the first to visit him in the hospital, and he began by saying, "God bless you, Mr. President." The House was a very different place in those pre-Gingrich years. I was working in a staff position there, so I observed some of this myself. The Democrats, when you get up to before the Republicans took over the House in 1994, for the 30, 40 years before that, the Democrats had been very much in control of the House, and there was never any question that they would be in control of the House. And the Republicans were willing to work with the Democrats. They're willing to cooperate on legislation, to support legislation, so long as they had some input, so long as the legislation was somewhat tailored to their policies, and so long as they got their projects and spending priorities engaged. There also there wasn't this great a great social separation as later became. This was partly because of the way the House worked in those days. When they were in session, they would be in session for most of the week. So members would bring their families to Washington and many of them would live in the suburbs, and their families would get to know each other through community events. Some of them had carpools to the Congress, or in some cases, bipartisan carpools back to their districts. This changed with the advent of jet travel, and also as a matter of policy. And since the Gingrich era, the House is frequently, when it meets, it's frequently in session only from Tuesday night to Thursday night. And as soon as Thursday night rolls around, the members all run to the airport and fly back to their districts where their families are located. And they don't have to come back until Tuesday night. When Gingrich got elected to the House, he had a long-range program in mind that he would change the way the House worked. And right after he was elected in '79, two famous political scientists, Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein, had dinner with Gingrich. And in this dinner, Gingrich revealed what his basic long-term approach would be. To quote from Mann and Ornstein's book, Gingrich believed that as long as Republicans went along to get along, cooperating with the Democrats to make the House work, the Democrats would stay in the saddle indefinitely. Republicans were going to have to nationalize the congressional election process and broaden the public hatred of Congress until enough voters became convinced that the place was thoroughly corrupt and dysfunctional, and that sweeping change was necessary. Gingrich disdained the kind of majority-minority partnerships that had worked so long for committees. He had a very grandiose view of his role in history. This was in the 1990s at a meeting with his supporters. He prepared a bunch of easel slides in his own handwriting, so the predecessor of PowerPoint, and there's no question that he said this because he wrote them out himself, and he was describing his mission in very almost unbelievably grandiose terms, that he would be advocate of civilization, definer of civilization, teacher of the rules of civilization, arouser of those who form civilization, organizer of the pro-civilization activists, and leader, possibly, of the civilizing forces. He engaged in a long-term campaign to coarsen and harden the language which Republicans used against Democrats. A very famous memo went out to the Democrats and the Republicans in 1990 from sponsored by Gingrich. And here are some of the words he said they should use in referring to Democrats. I'll just let you take them in briefly. And then in referring to themselves, Republicans should use such words as moral, courage, family, principle, prosperity, liberty, and children. At the outset, Gingrich had only a small group of Republican supporters, but his partisan anti-democratic approach gained traction as Republicans resented the autocratic control of the House by Speaker Jim Wright. One way Gingrich enhanced his position was to give very frequent speeches on the floor of the House, which could be videotaped and sent out all around the country. And the way he got to give so many speeches was he took advantage of a part of the House's daily routine, which is called special orders. Special orders take place after the House is adjourned for the day, and there's not going to be any more debates on bills or votes on bills. And in special orders, members are free to address the House on any subject they choose. This procedure wasn't very widely used by Gingrich, but he started using it very widely. And in the early days of his using it, he had a tremendous advantage, was that it was covered on C-SPAN, and C-SPAN would only focus on the speaker. So from watching the C-SPAN, you wouldn't know whether there was anyone at all listening to it. And here's what it really looked like, with no one there listening to it. And eventually C-SPAN changed its approach and started showing the empty chambers. Gingrich got elected as Republican whip, as I said, in 1989. In 1994, he led the Republican effort to take over the House. This was after Clinton was elected in 1992, and there was great dissatisfaction with Clinton and the Democrats at that time. Clinton had sponsored tax increases. Hillary had made a proposal for health care, which was very, might have been very workable, but it was also very complex and blasted. There was scandals in the House. Turned out the House had a bank where members could deposit their paychecks, and the bank was willing to let them write checks in advance of getting the paychecks and cover the balance later. And this led to several members having so many of these bounce, what would have been in a normal bank bounce checks, successful, and some members just stood down on the publicity over that. Gingrich also nationalized the congressional election by by proposing what he called a contract with America, which was a promise that within the first 100 days after they were elected, the Republicans would, in the House, would change House procedures to make them more democratic, and within 100 days they'd bring to the floor various bills and Republican policies, which had a lot of public support: balanced budgets, tough on crime bills, cutting welfare, etc. In supporting the contract with America, he made a speech which characterized his views, and it's if you look, it's a very dystopian, pessimistic view of how bad things are in America. And if you look at Trump's inaugural address in 2016, it takes the same basic views, somewhat different details, but that things are horrible in America. Gingrich's campaign message was, the underlying core pattern of where America is real trouble. The child abuse, the rape, the murders, the cocaine dealing, the problems of American life are unbelievable. I am a history teacher, and I tell every audience that it is impossible to maintain American civilization with 12-year-olds having babies, 15-year-olds killing each other, 17-year-olds dying of AIDS, and 18-year-olds getting diplomas they cannot read. It is an objective fact, if you're going to be honest about it, that we are in the middle of the largest moral and societal crisis we have had maybe in the country's history. So discounting the events leading up to the Civil War. If you look at Trump's view of America, American carnage, same sort of pessimistic view. When he became Speaker, he made it clear that he was going to be very partisan. In his first speech as Speaker, he said of the Democrats that they support a culture of violence which is destructive of this civilization. Under Democratic policies, we would truly have tyranny everywhere, and we in America would experience the joys of Soviet-style brutality and murdering of women and children. Bill Clinton was the enemy of normal Americans. He despises the values of the American people. Democrats would stop at nothing. They encouraged incest and child murder, caused an acceptance of brutality, and promoted multicultural nihilistic hedonism and the bureaucratic tyranny of America. Also during this time, he was a great spreader of conspiracy theories. A leading one was that the Clintons murdered people who were inconvenient. This particularly focused on allegations which never had the slightest bit of proof or credibility that Vince Foster, a White House counsel who had committed suicide, was actually murdered by the Clintons. And just the way things get repeated over Twitter today, that you don't have to endorse it, you just have to say that a conspiracy theory is plausible. Gingrich did that for the theories that the Clintons had murdered Vince Foster. He said there's something that doesn't fit about the whole case and the way it's been handled. Concerning Foster's suicide, he said, "I'm not convinced he didn't. I'm just not convinced he did. I don't accept it," he said, of repeating his suicide. "I believe there are plausible grounds to wonder what happened and very real grounds to wonder why it was investigated so badly." Another conspiracy theory was that the Clinton administration had delayed announcing the death of the Secretary of Commerce, Ron Brown, in a plane crash in Yugoslavia. And the delay was so that they could destroy papers, which would be embarrassing to the Clinton administration. He also implied that Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, was gay. He did this in a clever way by charging that Foley has come out of the liberal closet. Gingrich also refused to condemn the militia movement of the 1990s, whose beliefs were ultimately the basis for the biggest domestic terrorism act in America, the bombing of a federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995, which killed 168. The bomber was Timothy McVeigh, was not actually in a militia, but he was motivated by, he went to their meetings, learned of their theories, listened to Rush Limbaugh. He was very much influenced by it. For those of you who don't recall, the militia movement was a series of basically not connected, but they operated militias in many states. They had 40,000 to 250,000 members overall, and they went off in the woods and practiced military exercise, getting ready for the day when they'd have to resist the authoritarian left-wing forces in the United Nations, which are going to take over our government. They gained strength from the election of Clinton, the assault weapons ban, the Rodney King riots, and particularly from the death of dissenters after a standoff with federal authorities at Ruby Ridge and Mako. And as I said, in '95, Timothy McVeigh, who was a fan of the militias, bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. Gingrich refused to condemn the militia movements, and by implication, the bombing itself. This, you might say, is somewhat reminiscent of Trump saying there are fine people on both sides after the neo-Nazi demonstrations in Charlottesville. And this is after the Oklahoma City bombing. Gingrich was asked about the bombing and militia groups on Meet the Press. And he said, well, I think that people are allowed in a free country to get together for a lot of reasons. And I don't think you should condemn any group as a group. There is across the West a genuine sense of fear in the federal government. And this is not an extremist position in much of the West. I do think we have to understand that there is in rural America a genuine, and particularly in the West, a genuine fear of the federal government and of Washington, D.C. as a place that doesn't understand their way of life and doesn't understand their values. During his 4 years as Speaker, Gingrich didn't accomplish much in the way of getting conservative legislation passed. He was, period was also good for the Republicans politically, since under his leadership, there was a government shutdown and the unsuccessful attempt to impeach Bill Clinton, which led to Democratic gains in the election of 1998. Early after that, he was voted out of the speakership by conservative Republicans. Overall, his legacy is not one of the accomplishment of conservative objectives, but his ability to convert the whole atmosphere in the House and by extension to the country at large into polarization and lack of bipartisanship. He also engaged in some racism, particularly during the early 2000s. He said of Obama, he has exposed himself as a guy over and over and over again who has a deep-seated hatred for white people or the white culture. He said Obama's behavior was so outside our comprehension that it can be interpreted only if you understand Kenyan anti-colonial behavior. And he called Justice Sonia Sotomayor a Latina woman racist. Now let's turn to the final figure we'll be considering, Rush Limbaugh, the pioneer of partisan talk radio. That is the kind of radio show Limbaugh founded and was very successful with, was a show that would last for several hours. It would present only conservative views. That meant that his, as I said earlier, his listeners could just listen to him for a couple of hours a day and get all they needed in terms of being informed in politics and taking positions from his show. He was particularly appealing because he had a good sense of humor for his nasty positions, and he could make outrageous statements in a humorous way. He also it was appealing because he would be so outrageous, and people always wondered, is he going to be able to get away with this, or is he going to be fired or have to retract it? You remember in non-political issues, you remember Howard Stern was a pioneer in shock jocks, and he lost his job in Washington because after Air Florida an Air Florida flight taking off from National Airport crashed into the 14th Street Bridge. Howard Stern said, referred to a one-way ticket to the 14th Street Bridge. And that lost him his Washington job, although he was able to recover and have a continued success as a shock jock in New York. The type of show which Limbaugh had would have been basically difficult to impossible to operate over FCC licensed radio stations before 1987. The FCC had a fairness doctrine, and that required that if a radio station addressed, well, first they were obligated to address public issues, and they were also obligated to present contrasting viewpoints over their broadcast day. So if they were going to, if a commercial before 87 under the fairness doctrine, if someone had tried to do a 3-hour show like Limbaugh's, there would have to have been basically a 3 hours of liberal opinion during the rest of the day, which might have been less marketable. At the time, he developed his, he took off as a talk radio host. Limbaugh had been in radio a long time, but he showed no signs that he was going to become a national figure. He began working in radio as a high school student. He was a disc jockey, playing music in addition to sometimes running a news show. He later left broadcasting entirely and became a sales executive for the Kansas City Royals. With the repeal of the fairness doctrine, Limbaugh had a conservative talk show on one radio station with the help of a former executive of ABC News. They tried to develop a syndicated show, and it was wildly successful. He gave his first show on a single station in July 1988, and in 3 months it was being broadcast on 100 stations. Ultimately, it's was carried by 650 stations and had a weekly audience of 15.5 million. And this, of course, is the predecessor of conservative and liberal biased news on cable TV and on the internet, and beginning of an era in which people would only be exposed to one side of issues if they were so inclined. Limbaugh, in addition to being a radio star, became a major player in the Republican Party when he supported Pat Buchanan in the 1992 primaries. President Bush felt he needed to court Limbaugh to get his support, and he invited him in the White House to stay in the Lincoln bedroom. And in fact, he carried Rush's bags up to his room. In 2008, Michael Steele, who had been named chairman of the Republican National Committee, had criticized Limbaugh for his incendiary and ugly rhetoric, which may have led to, in Steele's view, led to the Democrats taking over the Congress. Steele was forced to apologize to Limbaugh. Limbaugh, on economic issues, generally took a conservative position. He was supported the general Republican agenda, low taxes and supply side economics. He was a little conflicted on free trade. He supported NAFTA in early days, but later became something of a protectionist. On climate change, he was more or less a denier. He speculated that deep water spill in the Gulf of Mexico had been caused by eco-terrorists operating under the direction of the Obama administration to justify a ban on drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. But his real strongest positions, most outrageous positions, were on culture war issues, particularly on blacks, women seeking equal rights, and gays. Some samples of the things he said. Particularly on blacks, he said the National Basketball Association to be renamed the Thug Basketball Association, and the teams renamed gangs. NFL football games all too often look like a game between the Bloods and the Crips without any weapons. He told a black caller who he could not understand to take the bone out of your mouth and call me back. He claimed that African Americans were systematically trained to hate the United States. He said that Obama is more African in his roots than he is American. He played a song on the air called Barack the Magic Negro and suggested that Obama was willfully exposing America to Ebola because the nation, Obama allegedly believed, deserves an Ebola outbreak as punishment for slavery. On other groups, he went along the invasion of Latino immigrants, said they were lazy and dependent on the government. He belittled the genocide of Native Americans. He said, only 4 million left. They all have casinos. What's to complain about? He showed his contempt for persons with disabilities by accusing Michael J. Fox of faking his research from Parkinson's disease, faking his shaking from Parkinson's disease to gain support for stem cell research. He was particularly disparaging of women. He constantly referred to feminists as feminazis. He said that feminism was established so that unattractive, ugly broads could have easy access across the mainstream of society. He called a Georgetown student, Sandra Fluke, a slut and a prostitute because Fluke supported requiring health insurance plans to cover reception. Limbaugh later apologized for these remarks. On Hillary Clinton was, of course, a famous favorite target. He joked to listeners that he was once on an elevator with Hillary, and she tore off all her clothes and begged, "Rush, make a woman out of me." Ronald Reagan said he tore off all his clothes and threw them at Hillary and said, "Fold these." Expressed his contempt and lack of sympathy for gays. He would give reports on the names of gays who were dying from AIDS. And in the background, he'd have Dionne Warwick singing, "I'll Never Love This Way Again," or Freddie Mercury singing, "Another One Bites the Dust." He later expressed regrets. He was also a supporter of or refused to condemn right-wing violence. After Waco, but before Oklahoma City terrorist attack, he told his listeners that their rights were under attack and that the second violent American revolution is just about, I got my fingers about a quarter of an inch apart, is just about that far away. Because these people are sick and tired of a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington driving into town and telling them that they can and cannot do. I'm going to break off here. Let's see whether any questions have come in. I want to, if there are questions or comments, people, please listen to these ones. So please feel free to comment, but I'd be glad to try to answer questions or give my reaction to comments. So
David, we do have a couple questions. Although before we get into questions, I do want to give you an opportunity. I know you worked on Capitol Hill, and I was wondering what kind of personal interactions or experiences you have with, say, Gingrich or any of the other plays you covered. I mean, just to give additional color. I mean, this is a lot to digest, but wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about any of your personal experiences with him.
Well, as it turned out, I was counsel and staff director on the House Aviation Subcommittee, and Gingrich was an active member of our committee, and he had to be because some of his most important constituents were Delta Airlines and Eastern Airlines. And in dealing with Democrats on our committee, he was very cordial and charming, and trying to persuade them to do the things that Delta and Eastern wanted. And he sometimes said that he was he liked this part of his work, the sort of the non-political partisan work. He liked doing the basic bread and butter work of being a congressman. And I once was part of a staff accompanying him on a tour of Delta Airlines. Congressmen with airlines and major airports would take congressional staff to their facilities and show them around, give them a chance to talk to the executives. And I particularly remember a lunch we had with Gingrich and some of the Delta Airlines executives. And Gingrich at that time was just a run-of-the-mill congressman who had some that might be perceived as crazy ideas. And I remember Gingrich gave a long speech to the at a lunch with the Delta executives, and he was sort of talking in grand historical terms, and he gave them suggested reading lists of scholarly and popular scholarly books on the subject. And you just see in my view, the Delta people raising their eyebrows about who is this guy? And years later, they found out. Okay, well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Now, so we have some interest in the fairness doctrine. So it was repealed in 1987. Was that of Congress, or just how did that come about?
It was done by the regulatory agency, the Federal Communications Commission itself, who had I guess a Reagan appointee as their chair, and Congress tried to pass legislation reinstating it, but then Reagan vetoed that legislation. So it was basically a decision of the Reagan administration. I think they were probably motivated by the fact that the conservatives seemed, or they suspected would be much more successful at talk biased radio than Democrats would be, and that's more or less proven to be the case, at least until we got to, certainly for talk radio, cable TV, it's a lot more even, I think.
So it could be reinstated through the executive branch, you said the FCC, is that who?
Well, they could reinstate it, but it would only apply to radio stations that had an FCC license. And in today's world, you're getting a lot of stuff in podcasts and internet news sites. Cable, they couldn't do it for cable TV. Cable TV is basically not regulated by FCC, so they could do it, but it wouldn't end the biased news we get today.
Right.
Before we
Yeah.
go on with the Q&A, can you stop showing your slides so that we can see the two of you conversing?
Sure. Okay.
So another one, so it's kind of a follow-up to that. I think you've already answered part of it. And it seems that a lot of the blame for today's divisiveness can be laid at the feet of the repeal of the fairness doctrine. Do you agree with that? And then can it be reinstated? So I think you've already covered that last part. But I mean, do you agree that maybe it kind of set things in motion, even if today we can't really use that same tool to, to combat the current divisiveness?
Yeah, I think it was a major factor because while that was in effect, you could get your news from, if you got your news from network TV or radio, it would have to be fairly balanced. I mean, and they did have these shows where conservatives debated liberals, but that was different. And it's sort of also the length of the shows where people could listen to them all day and not get their information, everything else. So I think it sort of set the wheels in motion.
Yeah, so here's an interesting point. I'll just preface it by pointing out a few things that were in your talk. I mean, Buchanan certainly, as you mentioned, did have some success in Republican primaries. Not, I guess he never really got a majority in any of the primaries. Now that same kind of movement that he started, the MAGA movement, I mean, it dominates the Republican Party. So here's the question: so we know someone like Mitt Romney, which is pushing back against that agenda, is from Utah. But where are the leaders and the voters now who supported, say, the conservatism that was represented by Reagan, the Bush family, or McCain? So where is that block of voters and politicians gone to? I think a lot of people are kind of trying to scratch their head, figure this out in the last few years. So I don't know if you have any insight at all on that one.
Well, it's kind of, I guess it's kind of complex. I mean, I think some of them have become never Trumpers, like Joe Scarborough and Liz Cheney and others. Others maybe would like to see that, but hold their nose because they're afraid that they're deathly afraid of there's enough. This is probably pretty familiar knowledge, but voters who vote in primaries today tend to be the more extreme members of the party, and there's enough support for what's evolved into Trumpism so that they can often beat a candidate who takes other points of view, and or at least force the one who wants to oppose Trump into spending a lot of money. I think there's on the high profile side, there's a number of people who are still the traditional Republicans, and but
would you consider DeSantis in the mold of, I guess we would refer to as MAGA, all this part of the party that you've kind of described the history of?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, he's big on their very big on their culture war issues. Certainly, I guess I don't know what his economic policies are, if any, but yeah, I think he's trying to be, in a sense, he's trying to be more MAGA than Trump is. I think he's trying to come on stronger than abortion, but he's not gaining much traction on that.
Right. So I think, just to kind of give one more shot at this, I mean, there does seem to be difficulty in anyone getting a foothold, say, anti-MAGA in the Republican Party, the Republican primary process. And that's what I think a lot of people are scratching their head over. But I mean,
one thing that has changed in the general electorate is that in the years since 2000, white males have become increasingly threatened as they become less and less of the population, and more and more of the population is either African American or Hispanic or Asian American. So the threat is greater. And then the election of Obama taught them that what can happen if we're not militant in their view. So I think there's more support now for the MAGA type approach, and this makes it even harder for Republicans who presumably know better to adopt the moderate positions.
Right. So you mentioned that the two-term election of President Obama might have actually stirred up some additional MAGA type support. I think a lot of people would concur with that. So I don't know how big that effect you think that effect was.
Well, can't give you statistics on it, but I think it had a major effect. It sort of was symbolized everything they feared, that the white males without a college education are no longer in control, and this showed how bad it had gotten, more than anything particularly did.
So I know you had a slide that you had up just momentarily. I think it was focusing on the influence of Rush Limbaugh on Justice Thomas. I think we do have a question. I think there's a number of people that are interested in that. I don't know if you necessarily have to put your slides back up, but maybe you could talk about that influence, and maybe how the influence of that this movement, if you want to call it, starting with Gingrich and on through Rush Limbaugh, has actually had an impact on some of the Supreme Court justice, maybe even more so than Justice Thomas.
Well, I think it's sort of, I mean, I don't see the, I mean, Thomas was, his views were formed before, or not much differently than Limbaugh took front and center. I think that the Supreme Court justices are in their own world, and they come out of a network that's been formed, starting with the Federalist Society, where they cultivate people who are going to take conservative positions on culture war issues and economic issues, and they all clerk for justices. You know, they only go to the top law schools, and they clerk for Thomas and Scalia and others, and they most of their work is in sort of the government or academic legal system, and so I don't think they're much influenced by what Limbaugh is saying. I think they've developed a lot of their views on their own.
Okay.
Sort of a
And
different.
yeah, so you're suggesting that's kind of a different movement, so to speak, that ends up sometimes getting us to the same place from a policy standpoint.
Yeah, I'd say often does one way or the other, but I don't. I mean, to some extent, I'm trying to develop a course now in the Supreme Court, and you have to sort out. They have their intellectual theories for how they decide cases of originalism, where they deal with what the people who sponsored the Constitution or the amendments after the Civil War had in mind, as compared with the liberals who believe in a more active Constitution, that it can be adjusted to meet modern needs. So there's certainly the objectives of the Republican parties and the legal philosophies they employ have a lot in common, and frequently they're willing to adjust their legal philosophies. Like if you're talking about history and what did the people sponsoring amendments have in mind, there's an awful lot of history you can cite one way or the other. But I really look at those more in two separate tracks.
I just want to let the two Davids know we're almost out of time. Can you go to the question that Eileen Janis asked?
Well, okay. I guess so. I think Buchanan was correct about the two Americas, with one group of professionals who are doing very well and the other group of non-college educated males who have had wage stagnation. What I can't figure out is what the Republicans offer them other than anger. What's Buchanan, Gingrich, Limbaugh's solution to the two Americas?
Well, I'm not sure how much, but I mean, Trump's solution is certainly more protectionism and not letting, trying to put checks on sales of cheaply made products from foreign countries in the United States by putting tariffs on them. I think the solution, I mean, to the extent the solution is going to solve the problem through international trade, I think it's clamping down on free trade, which ends up that a lot of free trade, foreign countries can produce things more efficiently and at lower cost than our workers can. And so if there's free trade, the workers who produce those things that can be turned over to foreign countries are going to lose their jobs. I mean, you can try other programs of enhancing their ability to get jobs or supporting development of industries within our own country. But the free trade theory was just sort of a pure economic theory that everyone's better off. We get cheaper goods and get to sell them more, but turned out to at the least involve a lot of dislocation.
Okay. And so here's one character you didn't mention, Grover Norquist. So can you comment on the effects of the anti-tax positions that he advocated, and what kind of connection is there with those kinds of positions and just the general anti-government rhetoric that has been used by many of these individuals that you talked about?
Well, he was very important, and I don't know that I think of him as coming on a little later than some of these guys did, but his idea that a Republican could never support a tax increase was very influential. I guess there would be mutual feedback loops between the two of them, but he wasn't an accolade of any of the others. He was sort of his own boss on this. That got to some very interesting issues when I was in Congress, that if you have a gasoline tax and the money goes to build highways, is that really a tax, or is that what they call a user fee paid for by the people who use the roads? And Reagan was willing to say it was user fees, and he was the last one to be able to support an increase in the gasoline tax so we could buy more roads. But I think the Norquist crowd decided that was a tax too. But yeah, he really had a veto power over Republican positions.
Which does raise another question I've always had in my mind. Why do we not see politicians that want the various government programs or strong departments to really go out there and talk about all the great things that government does, such as whether it's for make sure our food supply is safe, or build our highways, or air traffic control, and so on and so forth. And why doesn't it happen? I use that as a precursor to this, probably the last question here. So it says, thanks you for your great presentation, and that a lot of the targets of the right wing are journalists and Democrats, and they seem to have kept their heads down and done their jobs for 30 years. We've ignored the right wing's gerrymandering, redistricting efforts, though they are finally more fair efforts afoot. While I'd never like the rest of us to be name calling and lie spreading, what is the better course in your opinion? I mean, is there something that people could do, politicians or journalists, to kind of combat this really, not so nice strategy that has been developed over the years?
Well, they try. I think Biden's campaign is going to be a lot of emphasis on what he's accomplished for the economy and various disadvantaged segments of the economy. And Democrats try, but it just, for whatever reasons, the MAGA crowd and others are not inclined to believe it. I mean, I think this may be evolving, but the Republicans would always be able to successfully argue that the Democrats were wimps on national security, and the Democrats could always argue, going back to Herbert Hoover and beyond, that the Republicans were out to benefit the rich and destroy the economy. And why can't the Democrats get through and make the case that Social Security is great? Medicare took millions of people who couldn't afford health care into getting the benefits of health care, et cetera. It just doesn't get through because of pre-existing biases, I guess.
Okay, well, I think we'll have to leave it there and leave it for people to ponder that question that you've posed. And I'll just let the people know, I mean, this was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. I'll let our audience know that if you are a member of Encore Learning, David probably is going to have a course in the near future on topics of this ilk, something to do with government politics. So you'll want to, if you love this presentation as I did, you'll want to look for that course and sign up for it. So with that, David, thank you very much for taking the time to enlighten all of us on this history and what the current state of affairs is.
Well, thank you, David and Chris, for helping put this together and giving it such good publicity, and for your contributions in the discussion.
Yeah, we've got a lot of positive reactions, which I think is something new. We have that turned on now. So I think a lot of other people enjoyed it as well. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you for your insightful questions, and look forward to seeing you in our next presentation.
I liked all the applause, all the hearts, and the thumbs up. Thank you,
Right.
audience.
Right. Okay.